Welcome, everybody, to the second Asian American, and Pacific Islander Heritage Week. I am Andrew Zhao, Associate Professor of Anthropology and President of the AAPI Faculty and Staff Association at the University of Louisville. So, like I said, we have an excellent program, but before that, I would like to tell you a little about our group. The AAPI FSA is an employee resource group that was established in the aftermath of the Atlanta SPAR shootings and surging anti-Asian hatred in 2021. We initially started the group to offer a safe space for Asian Pacific Islanders to speak their mind. And over time, we expanded our vision and purpose. Our vision is to build community, promote diversity, and champion action and change for the AAPI populations on campus. The purpose of the AAPI FSA is to foster community and a sense of belonging for the AAPI populations at U of L, and increase visibility for the AAPI community, empower AAPI individuals by providing mentorships and other opportunities, promote awareness of the challenges and unique experiences of the AAPI community, and to build alliances to advance the university's mission for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Ultimately, our goal is to make U of L a great place to learn, a great place to work, and a great place to discover and connect. And we're doing that through events like this today. In the current environment, it really takes a village to make events like this happen. Many individuals, organizations, and groups are instrumental in the preparation for our Heritage Week. I'm not going to go over the entire list because I'm afraid I don't have enough time for that, and I don't want to miss anybody. But here, I especially want to recognize the enormous efforts of our executive board who have put into these weekly events. E-board members, please stand up or raise your hands. It's been quite a journey leading up to today's event. I'm so happy and grateful that you all are with me on this journey. I also want to recognize our advisory board who are super helpful in so many ways. Advisory board members, please stand up or raise your hand. I'm looking forward to working with you to develop new programs. We're also so very grateful for the generous support of our co-sponsors. Without any particular order, I want to thank the Office of Diversity and Equity, the Office of Community Engagement, the Commission on Diversity and Racial Equity, CODRA, Center for Asian Democracy, the Asian Studies Program, the Athletic Department DEI Office, the SGA, COSWA, Office of Community Engagement and Diversity Inclusion in the School of Nursing, the Office of Procurement, and last, certainly not the least, Asian Institute, Crane House. A tremendous partner and sponsor of today's keynote is Mr. Lee Gill. Mr. Lee Gill is our Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Louisville. He has a long, stellar history of being a champion for diversity throughout his professional career, and has already made a major impact since joining U of L in May 2022. He is a good friend of our speaker today, so it is fitting that he introduce her today. Please join me in welcoming Lee Gill.
Good afternoon. It is indeed a pleasure to see all of you in these seats this afternoon and to be here to listen to a person that I have known for over 20 years. When I was dean of the Institute for Diversity and Leadership at Lake Michigan College in Benton Harbor, Michigan, Evelyn and I first started our journey. It seemed like every place I've gone, I've always had Evelyn to stop by and say words of wisdom and intellectual stability as it relates to AAPI. She is truly outstanding. Before we start, I want to thank CODRA. Where's our CODRA members at? Y'all come on, raise your hand. I just want to say, because this program was so important, our CODRA members canceled their meeting so that the membership could join us here this afternoon. And I just think that's tremendous. That's teamwork, making these kinds of programs as important as they are to the entire university. Let me just say a couple of things. First off, Evelyn De-Hart, Professor of History, American Studies, and Ethnic Studies at Brown University. She is the director for the Center of the Study of Race and Ethnicity at Brown from 2002 to 2014, director of the Consortium on Advanced Studies in Cuba during 2014-2015 academic year, and again in the spring of 2019. She received her BA in political science from Stanford University and her PhD in Latin America, Caribbean history from the University of Texas at Austin. In 2015-2016, she was visiting professor in history at NTU in Singapore. Evelyn is one of those unique persons. For some of you who may remember NCORE before the pandemic. Anybody remember NCORE? A few, okay. NCORE, for some of you who may not know, is the largest conference regarding race and ethnicity in higher education. You would go to NCORE every year and there's 4,000 or 5,000 people that attend NCORE. Of course, the pandemic had a little bit to do with slowing that up. But Evelyn always was one of the key speakers at our NCORE conference. She is dynamic, she is personable, and let me just say, one of the best friends I have in higher education. Please welcome this afternoon, Dr. Evelyn De-Hart.
You know, I shadow him. And if Lee keeps moving, I'm going to see the rest of this country. I started in Michigan with him. Then we moved to Akron, Ohio. Then we moved to Clemson. And now I'm here in Louisville. Where will we go next, Lee? But in a more somber note, my heart goes out to all of you in Louisville as you're struggling with this horrible tragedy. And I hope that our leaders in this country will really finally get down to do something. The rest of the world is watching us and wonder if we have gone mad. So thank you, Dr. Lee Gill, for inviting me to visit this beautiful campus and for introducing me to Professor Andrew Zhao and the wonderful AAPI faculty and staff that I have been meeting today. I hope I'll get to meet some of the students as well. I understand that you have invited me now in April to celebrate AAPI month, which is usually May. But since May, here and on my home campus at Brown, is also the beginning of the end of the semester, we've kind of moved this a little bit forward in our calendar. So here I am today. This year we have a lot to think and worry about, given what has already been mentioned by Dr. Zhao and Lee, the public violence against Asian persons that are reported in the news almost every day. The first reported incident that provoked national outrage and concern occurred in Atlanta in March 2021, when 6 Asian American women working in massage parlors were murdered in broad daylight by a young white man. And since then, so many unprovoked public attacks are mostly vulnerable, that is, elderly, women, and poor Asian Americans, that they are really hardly alarming news anymore. But is anti-Asian persecution and violence, both physical and political, a new phenomenon in American history and society? Or is it another example of racial violence, and how so? But let's start with some happy news about Asians in America. I say happy because they are interesting for appearing in a most unlikely place and way. Hence, they tickle our fancy and give us a small measure of pleasure. I know that this is a basketball-crazy state and town, and so am I. I watched many of the March Madness contests, especially the last rounds, when they got down to the last 16, then 8, then 4, then 2. That's when my eyes were drawn to 2 key personalities, a player and a coach. One, playing for the University of Miami, was named Isaiah Wong. The other was a coach for the Kansas State team. The next slide, Jerome Tang. Isaiah Wong and Jerome Tang. Most viewers, I wager, saw them as 2 outstanding black players and coaches who dominate the college basketball landscape. But I zeroed in on their last names, Wong and Tang, which are clearly Asian, specifically Chinese. So I did some research and indeed confirmed that they were descendants of Chinese men who had migrated to America several generations ago. 2 black men with Chinese names. How cool is that? Even more, they set the stage for my talk today. Now, if time permits, after I finish my lecture, and if you are interested, I can delve deeper into the Asian heritage and how 2 black men have Chinese names. Today, I plan to share with you my reading of American history, focusing on the place of Asians in the history from the mid-19th century to the present, when Asians began arriving in the United States in a near unbroken movement from Hawaii and the West Coast to New England and across the country, right here in Louisville. Beginning with Chinese, followed by Japanese, Filipinos, Koreans, South Asians, and Southeast Asians, today comprising some 20 different Asian ethnicities and nationalities, how Asians are received, racially constructed, socially integrated, politically incorporated, is a story of twists and turns, full of contradictions, and seldom taught in our classrooms, including great universities such as, I would not be surprised, this one. I would also like to assert at the outset that this history should not be of interest and concern only to Asians, but to all of us, because by examining Asians among us, we are holding a mirror to ourselves, to our own fears, anxieties, biases, questioning who we are and where we go from here. To overcome biases, first, we must confront our own fears, and to do that, we must study and deal with history. History is powerful. That is why it is so often politically contested. And it can be used to subjugate by perpetuating ignorance, or to liberate by enlightenment. So let me now turn your attention to this image of the iconic Statue of Liberty, welcoming all immigrants to America, particularly those seeking a better life for themselves and their families. Who doesn't warm to the image of Lady Liberty? What schoolchild in America has not learned the stirring words of Emma Lazarus, carved at the base of the statue? Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. This is the reason why America self-defines as exceptional, a new land built by and for immigrants. By the time the statue was erected in New York Harbor in 1886, our country had become multiracial and multicultural, receiving peoples from all over the world, flooding the country with immigrants assumed to become settlers of the land while the country expanded territorially. But please take note, not all who came to America arrived under the same conditions, received in the same manner. In fact, many were not included in the generous depiction of America as a tolerant and capacious land that Emma Lazarus proclaims in her soaring words. African Americans, hundreds of thousands of them, who first arrived as enslaved people in 1619, and for hundreds of years after, they and their American-born children remained enslaved, defined by our law as property more than human beings, and certainly not citizens, until President Lincoln freed them in 1865. It's difficult to construct them as immigrants. The first Spanish speakers were incorporated territorially. The Mexicans in 1848, when the US invaded Mexico and took half of our national territory, that became California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. Then the Puerto Ricans in 1898, after the US defeated Spain in another war. So it's not possible to construct them as immigrants because they didn't leave the front door of their homes. They didn't move. Of course, Native Americans were here to begin with and didn't immigrate from another land. Their relationship with the United States was based on hundreds of treaties signed between two sovereign entities. Besides diverse Europeans that Emma Lazarus beckoned, one group of newcomers in mid-19th century did cross an ocean to arrive in America, recruited by entrepreneurs in need of massive, cheap labor to work in mines, agriculture, and railroad construction in the newly incorporated territory of California and the American West and Southwest, land previously part of Mexico. I am referring, of course, to the tens of thousands of Chinese immigrants who came to America from across the vast Pacific. They seem to fit the image of immigrants, the poor and huddled masses, memorialized by Emma Lazarus. So let's take a quick look at these newcomers and the work they performed in the 19th century to literally help this country grow and prosper. Can you go back to the first of these slides, to number 6? I just want to show you first all the jobs that these first Chinese immigrants performed. Mining, no, let's go on. Railroad construction, no, the Great Transcontinental Railroad. Here are various slides of the railroad construction infrastructural project through the high Sierras and through the snow, and the tunnels that these immigrants built with the great skills that they brought with them. And then, of course, they were also laborers. In this case, in agriculture. The Chinese were market gardeners, or truck gardeners, we call them, growing food, vegetables, and fruits mainly for the urban tables, for the people who live in the cities. And then they would peddle the food, you know, and they walked around the neighborhood selling the food that they grew, that they grow. You can see that. And even in this case, I love the slide because it's in some part of Arizona, I believe, that this peddler, instead of walking, had a horse cart, right? So these are all the various jobs that they did. Okay, stop here. By the 1870s, well over 100,000 Chinese had arrived in America. You know what? Can you see these slides clearly? Maybe we could lower the lights a little bit so you can see them. Can you? Because they're really beautiful slides. Can you see them? Now you can't go too low because then I can't read. Go up a little bit. Yeah, that's good, right? Now you can see the slides better, right? Okay. By the 1870s, well over 100,000 Chinese had arrived in America. They were mostly laborers, almost all men, with but a small handful of women, and some were shopkeepers and merchants. However, behind these images of hard-working immigrants from Asia lies another story that emerged alongside the photographs we just saw of Chinese toiling away in various jobs. Please look with me at these popular images of Chinese immigrants that quickly emerged. So look at the next few slides, okay? Right? Just look at them a bit. Okay. Keep on going. You see how from the very beginning of their arrival, they were caricatured and depicted in ugly, malicious, and pernicious ways, a threat to American security and menace to society. In particular, a grave threat to the purity of white American womanhood. If you go back to the slide with the lions, do we have one? Let's look at that one, okay? The purity of white American womanhood, widely disseminated in mass-consumed popular magazines, these caricatures were unsparing in calling for violence against Chinese workers, crudely exposing unambiguous, unabashed racism, often maligned at the same breath as the also dreaded free black man, and to whom the N-word was also applied. Can you advance the slides now? I want to see the one. Oh, see, this is the one about the swarms of Chinese immigrants coming into San Francisco. I'll pick up the theme of this one shortly. Let's go to the next one. Okay, the next one. Okay, stop. In short time, the Asian earned his own racist label of yellow peril, which was represented in diverse and nefarious ways, culminating in the enactment of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prohibited further entry of Chinese workers to America. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, the next one. All right. First, we see the yellow peril as a swarm of locusts wiping up fields of cultivated crops. The yellow peril. No? Next, the yellow peril was humanized, if you will, as a Horatio Alger, Oriental Horatio Alger. Look at this one. On the left-hand side, you see a apparently hard-working Chinese worker doing a lot of jobs at the same time, multitasking, we would say today. But instead of being praised for hard work, look at the other half of the slide. He is reviled for working too hard at too many jobs. So what is the message that this slide conveys, this narrative captured in this one picture and received by those who saw it in the 1870s? What this slide says is that by working so hard, the Chinese worker caused young white men to be unemployed. Thus idled, they head to a life of crime and the penitentiary. Can you see that story? No? This incredible narrative captured in one slide. No? Equally condemned as pernicious and dangerous, let's look at the next slide. Equally condemned as pernicious and dangerous was the too enterprising Chinese shopkeeper who monopolized business opportunities. So the Chinese worker monopolized jobs, idling white workers, young white men in particular, sending them off to a life of crime and the penitentiary. And here's the enterprising Chinese shopkeeper, monopolizing business opportunities. Surrounded by this onslaught of anti-Chinese animus, is it any wonder that politicians weighed in, as you can see in these posters, calling for Chinese exclusion? A federal law by this name, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, became the nation's first immigration law. You probably didn't know that. Until the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, we did not have any immigration law. The first one was the Chinese Exclusion Act, an immigration law designed to exclude, not to welcome in. Just before Emma Lazarus uttered her stirring words, we had this Chinese Exclusion Act passed by the federal government, immigration being a federal law. By this time, the Chinese had learned that they were already politically excluded. Here's another fact that most of you probably have never learned in any of your classes from grade school on through college. The 1790 naturalization law of the newly formed United States Republic stipulated that only free white immigrants could become citizens through naturalization. The Chinese who tried to acquire citizenship and stay in America were dismissed as, and here's a label, in quotation marks, aliens ineligible for citizenship. Furthermore, they were already being erased from history. I'm talking about 1882. Excluded from coming into this country, denied access to citizenship, and now I'm going to show you how by 1882 they were already erased from history. Look at this iconic image based on a famous photograph. What was being commemorated? Who is missing? This is a commemoration of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad connecting the United States from east to west, from the Pacific to the Atlantic. Here you see well-attired, obviously important white men and women, entrepreneurs, investors, businessmen, politicians, and many white male workers. The Irish, who built the Union Pacific across the Plain State, westward, from east to west. But you see no Chinese workers who built the Central Pacific through the snow and the granite of the high Sierras. Let's look at those slides again of the Chinese railroad workers. The next few slides, okay? The Chinese railroad workers who had the much more difficult task of building the Union Pacific part of the Transcontinental Railroad through the high Sierras, blasting through the mountains, through the snow. They were nowhere to be found in that commemorative painting. This iconic image, therefore, of the celebration of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad demonstrates how the Chinese railroad construction workers, without whose labor this massive infrastructural project that connected the American empire from Pacific to the Atlantic could never have been completed, and yet were unceremoniously erased from history. By the end of the 19th century, other Asians who were not yet excluded, the 1882 law at first only excluded Chinese workers. So other Asians began arriving in California and the West in considerable numbers, attracted by mostly agriculture jobs and other economic opportunities. They were the Japanese, including some Koreans who came as part of the Japanese Empire. Okay. And when the first, who were subjects, and South Koreans and East Indians of the British Empire. No? When the US enacted our first comprehensive immigration law in 1924, the first comprehensive immigration law, we made the exclusion of Asians a blanket one by delineating what was called in this law the Asiatic Barred Zone. That means no Asians of any ethnicity from anywhere could come to the US. All ethnic groups from Asia were barred with the exception of Filipinos. Why? Because Filipinos were subjects of the American Empire. The American Empire, which had extended across the Pacific all the way to the Philippines at the end of the 19th century. By this time, California and other Western states compounded the exclusion of those Asians who had remained by enacting what were called alien land laws, which denied aliens ineligible for citizenship to own the very land that they were cultivating. I hope by now you are taking note of the recurrent use of the label alien to racialize and marginalize Asians, and we will see more of the use of alien in the 20th century. Dismissing them as aliens renders them forever foreign, politically and socially, never to become a settler and a citizen like other immigrants, and for being irredeemably strange, culturally unassimilable, and inherently inferior. Indeed, the label alien was pressed into service again in World War II, when America decided on a drastic measure to deal with Asians already in America. Remember 24 Asiatic bar zones says no more Asians could come. What happened in the 40s when the US entered World War II? They had to decide, we had to decide, what do we do with these Asians already in America? Almost 130,000 Japanese in America were then rounded up in the West, forcibly removed from their homes and businesses, and incarcerated in concentration camps located, one in California and others in remote corners of Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Arizona on an Indian reservation, and yes, one in the South in Arkansas. They were entire families of non-citizen parents and grandparents, as well as many children and young men and women born and raised in America, fully Americanized and American citizens by virtue of birthright citizenship enshrined in the 14th Amendment, which was enacted to give those free from slavery American citizens. Here's a very good example of the linked fate of the histories of peoples of African descent and peoples of Asian descent in this country. No? That those children born of parents otherwise ineligible for citizenship, the aliens ineligible for citizenship, by virtue of birth on American territory, the children of these Japanese who were interned in concentration camps were actually US citizens interned. Then they comprised 60% or so of those put in these camps for having done nothing wrong. Nothing wrong. No. And how were they labeled? How were these Japanese labeled? They were labeled enemy aliens. Enemy aliens. Once again, we see the term alien being used. No? I want to show you just very quickly. Can we do? This is a slide of the camp in California, in the Tule Lake concentration camp. And look at the plaque that was enacted in 1979. It says Tule Lake, May 1942 to March 1946, almost 4 years this camp operated. It was one of 10 American concentration camps. This is a word used on the plaque now. Concentration camps established during World War II to incarcerate 110,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, of whom the majority were American citizens, behind barbed wire and guard towers, without charge, trial, or establishment of guilt. By the way, seizure and mass incarceration of Japanese in America was carried out by two of our most prominent liberal political leaders, President Franklin Roosevelt and then California Attorney General Earl Warren, later to become Chief Justice of perhaps the most liberal Supreme Court. So I want to emphasize that these draconian race-based anti-Asian actions were not a partisan matter of right or left. With the Japanese Americans isolated in concentration camps, other Asians in America kept a low profile. Their total numbers beneath 1 million, safely tucked away in obscurity, pretty much out of national consciousness. At best, a small oriental blip in the popular imagination, mostly personified as food. Chop suey, wonton, chow mein, eagerly embraced by working class families as a cheap and tasty meal. This situation began to change in the 1960s, when immigrants from Asia started arriving again because the immigration law changed in 1964, which removed the Asiatic barred zone. It is important to note that they arrived on the heels of the great civil rights movement, when Black activists led by Dr. Martin Luther King, the great John Lewis, and others forced America to deal with institutionalized racism, specifically the Jim Crow laws that mandated racial segregation. Indeed, dismantling racial segregation at home forced America, President Johnson, to reform our racially exclusive immigration law. Another example of linked fate. At the same time, another threat was looming on the horizon: the rise of Asian tigers or dynamic economies in Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, eventually China, which became the biggest Asian tiger of all. Just as the United States could not differentiate between a militarist Japanese empire and peaceful Japanese immigrant families in America during World War II, the same anxiety concerning Asia rising grips the American popular imagination, a fear which casts an ominous shadow over America. It didn't take long before some resentful Americans lashed out at Asian Americans. It happened in Detroit. Let's move to the next slide. On June 19, 1982, when two unemployed white auto workers, Detroit, father and son, chased a young Asian man out of the bar where he was enjoying his bachelor party, chased him into the dark night street, and bludgeoned him to death with baseball bats. The reason for this wanton act of violence? They blamed him for losing their jobs to Japanese auto competition. Never mind that the murdered young Asian American, whose name was Vincent Chin, was born in America of Chinese ancestry and had nothing to do with Japan or its auto industry. The brutal perpetrators were each fined $3,000 but didn't spend a night in jail. That two white Americans killed an innocent Asian American with impunity was a rude wake-up call to Asians in America that deep-seated anti-Asian animus was resurfacing. With the new immigration law of 1965, Asian American numbers grew rapidly and dramatically, from under 1 million, as we noted earlier, to 7 million by the 1990s, and then multiplied threefold to 22 million today. Comprised of some 20 distinct ethnic groups who trace their homelands to a large geopolitical region called Asia, geography being the only thing these otherwise diverse and distinct peoples share, other than some vague physical traits. The post-war Asian immigrants are finally able to acquire citizenship through naturalization. When remember the old 1790 naturalization law, which had denied citizenship to Asian immigrants? When was that law changed? 1952. Count how many years Asian immigrants were denied access to citizenship. By then, in aggregate group statistics, Asian Americans have become the most highly educated racial ethnic group, surpassing white Americans for holding college degrees, which in turn has led to good-paying professional and managerial jobs. According to the latest census, Asian Americans earn the highest family income, thus surpassing white Americans and outpacing other minorities. Some refer to them as the good immigrants. Title of an important new book by historian and Professor Madeline Hsu of the University of Texas at Austin. Note the subtitle. That's the next theme I'm coming to. How the Yellow Peril Became the Model Minority. And take a look at the cover of this book. It actually depicts my family immigrating to America. I was one of the little persons in this photo. Instead of allowing Asian Americans to finally, quietly integrate into American society as productive citizens, finally Asian Americans were allowed to become citizens, the media and policy makers rallied to call attention once more to Asians in America, this time marking the good immigrants as a model minority. Model minority. That is, a minority that models good behavior. it is significant that this new sobriquet, this identity label, does not praise Asian Americans as model Americans. Think of the implications of this critical choice of one word. Model minority, not model Americans. When this characterization first appeared during the Cold War, the Asian American as a model minority was first used to humiliate China by pointedly remarking how Chinese immigrants fleeing communism at home flourish in a free and capitalist United States. This anxiety about a rising China can also turn against the Asian American model minority when Chinese students and scientists are periodically accused of acting as spies for communist China. In 1999, Republican Congressman Christopher Cox issued a multi-volume report on national security and the People's Republic of China, in which he accused every 80,000 Chinese students in America for being tasked to steal high-tech secrets. This fear led to spy accusations brought against several Chinese Americans. That year, the next one, 1999, the United States accused Dr. Wen-Ho Lee of New Mexico's Los Alamos National Laboratory, where the nuclear bomb was developed, of spying for communist China. Dr. Lee was a multi-generational Taiwanese who came to the US to pursue higher education, receiving his PhD in mechanical engineering from Texas A&M. He became a US citizen in 1974 and quietly raised an American family with 2 US-born children. Accusations against him of giving US nuclear secrets to China were never substantiated, charges were never formally lodged, and he was eventually freed from jail after 278 days spent in solitary confinement without trial or access to bail. Another Asian American accused of spying for communist China, the next one, was a US-born James E., West Point graduate who served in the US military in Syria, where he converted to Islam and married his Palestinian wife. Shortly after he was appointed the Muslim chaplain at US Naval Base at Guantanamo, Cuba, attending to the prisoners of 9/11, almost all Muslims, he too was accused of espionage. What could be more threatening to US national security, you might ask, than a Muslim Asian American? Charges against him were also dropped. Meanwhile, the news keep on treating readers periodically to sensational stories of how Chinese American scientists at leading American universities collaborate with fellow scientists in China to threaten US national security, implicating Asian Americans as unpatriotic citizens selling American secrets to communist China. Anxiety about Asia rising, first Japan, now China, continues to reinforce deep-seated fears about Asian Americans, the model minority, as perpetual foreigners who can never be trusted. From the Cold War to the present, the model minority is used as an instrument of US foreign policy and geopolitical struggle for world power and domination. Whenever tensions heat up in the global competition between China and the US, as we are witnessing in this current moment, Asian American vulnerability turns them into hypervisible, easy targets. Meanwhile, at home, The Asian American model minority is useful in another way, serving as surrogates for another purpose. Asians are lauded for modeling good behavior, not so much to prove their own worth, but to dispute the argument laid out by African Americans that systemic racism poses a near insurmountable barrier to their upward social mobility. In this insidious and invidious comparison, pitting a minority marked as successful against a minority struggling to advance, the clear and unequivocal message is that Asians in America are definitively not Black, and showcasing Asian Americans as a successful minority by dint of their own virtuous behavior vindicates the US system as a fair one that is not racist. If one minority can succeed, then the system is not racist. This is one cynical way how the Asian model minority can be used to uphold the status quo, one increasingly being labeled white supremacy. It is one reason why Asian Americans are sometimes inducted into American society as honorary whites. So whether as a perverse yellow peril, a pernicious spies, or honorary whites, Asians in America are constantly being moved along the spectrum of racial stereotypes, an unstable moving target. So let me conclude by pulling up the late 19th century yellow peril caricature, condemning the Chinese laborer or coolie by working too hard at too many jobs, thus depriving young white men of work. What I'm suggesting and my conclusion is this: the model minority is the other side of the same yellow peril coin. More polished, more subtle to be sure, but fundamentally a yellow peril redux, two sides of the same coin. Most stereotypes contain its own contradiction. So it is that the model minority is beginning to unravel in the wake of growing public hostility against Asian Americans precisely because they are perceived as a minority that overreaches, a minority that is overrepresented, a minority that is hence uppity. In effect, America is once again blaming the victims of contrived political crimes and public hate crimes for provoking the anxiety and resentment that incite violence against them. Elite universities like Harvard, Yale, and my institution, Brown, play into this game by limiting acceptance of high-achieving Asian American students because they are labeled an overrepresented minority. If too many are admitted, they argue, Asian Americans would edge out other minorities, the underrepresented minorities, Black, Latinos, Native Americans. When, in fact, I suggest the anxiety is about outcompeting whites. Responding to the spate of public anti-Asian attacks, some commentators and politicians question whether anti-Asian violence can even exist, given how well Asian Americans are doing in American society in view of their model minority status. Last year, my university's diversity and inclusion plan removed Asian Americans from consideration as a protected class because they are overrepresented, implicitly counting them as honorary whites. Asian Americans did not name themselves a model minority. It was invented by white Americans and imposed on them. Most of us academics and activists are terribly uneasy about this backhanded flattery and have called out the Asian American model minority as a myth. Here is why it is wrong and dangerous. It is a stereotype, and like all stereotypes, it functions to paint an entire community of people with a very broad brush in the service of maintaining the interest of the powerful. Not all Asian Americans are well-educated, high-earning overachievers. In fact, Asian Americans exhibit what we call bimodal characteristics. That is a high and low end. A comfortable professional and business class at the top, towering over a mass of working class and poor on the other end. The income gap between upper and lower ends in Asian America is the highest of all racial groups in America. Putting it another way, the Asian American community is not homogeneous. It is sharply differentiated by ethnic and national origins, religion, language, culture, and very importantly, divided by socioeconomic status or class. The danger of the model minority stereotype is that it brushes over, even erases, the working class and the poor. But you saw them in the lives of the 6 Asian immigrant women massage workers killed in Atlanta, and in the mostly elderly victims of public attacks in or near Chinatowns in the streets of our cities. These victims are not model minority Asian Americans. So to conclude this quick reading of Asian American history, I argue that anti-Asian animus is real. It is persistent and deeply rooted in American history. It is a form of racism built on pernicious stereotypes, which are then used to attack Asian Americans and persons. The yellow peril, the model minority, these are stereotypes constructed by the white dominant society, imposed on Asian Americans, and then used to turn against Asian Americans and blame them for the violence that is perpetrated against them. Asian migration to America takes place in the crucible of American empire, the acquisition of California from Mexico, the extension over the Pacific to settle Hawaii and colonize the Philippines, to the wars in China with Japan and Southeast Asia, coveting their labor but rejecting their persons, whether in railroad construction or agriculture in the 19th century, as service workers or massage parlors, or as well-educated professionals. The uneasiness of fully integrating Asian Americans into American national identity, the ambivalence towards their belonging in America, is an American dilemma with no clear resolution in sight. To many in America, Asian Americans are still alien, a perpetual foreigner, who are sometimes useful as surrogates for upholding white supremacy. The hard-working Chinese coolie laborer of yesteryear, accused of sending unemployed white youth to the penitentiary, the Asian immigrant woman massage parlor workers killed for provoking the young white man's sex addiction, in the middle class, well-educated, but overrepresented Asian American model minority, suspected of endangering America's national security, even as they are used to rebuke other minorities for their failure to thrive. The message is Asian Americans are responsible for generating the fear and loathing that incites violence and persecution against them. The Asian American story is an American dilemma that continues to entangle us as long as America is still debating our national identity and who belongs. I fear in the sober moment that complete, abiding, unequivocal Asian American inclusion in American society can be illusory and remains largely elusive. The barriers, both subtle and glaring. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Thank you. I know I probably, oh, good, I still have some time, great. I welcome your comments. One thing I hope you've noticed, I try to show the linked fate of all of us, no? It's not good to study any of our history in silos because we don't exist in silos. You know, behind every question, there's another story, right?
This one.
Yeah.
I want that. This one is not
Question? Okay.
Well, were there any reparations for people who had their, things
Reparations, thank you.
taken from them, or whatever phrase you want to
Good
use?
question, another good question. During President Reagan's time, he signed the law of reparations for the Japanese who were interned, but only if they were still alive. Their descendants couldn't collect. And if they were still alive at that time, they got $20,000, which hardly made up for what they lost. But an official apology, okay? It was something. Now, you see, you asked me one question, I'm going to give you two stories back. Another group who got reparations were the Japanese from Latin America. Hey, we were not content with just rounding up Japanese in the USA, America, and put them in camps. We went down to Peru. We went down to South America, to Mexico, rounded up their Japanese residents and put them in camps in the US. They got $10,000 if they were still alive. Huh? How about that? Didn't have ever heard of that, right? Yes. Yes. Any other questions? I've got lots of stories to tell. You call me.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have a couple of questions coming from people who put stuff
Who
in
zoomed
our
in,
board.
right? Yeah.
Yep, who zoomed in either to attend your lecture or sent questions in
Okay.
advance.
Okay.
But one of our big questions is here at the University of Louisville, we don't have like an Asian study. Well,
Yeah,
we have
Asian American study.
Asian American Studies department. We don't have a Asian American Student Initiatives program. And so something that we're thinking about as we're thinking about, okay, how are we going to include and champion AAPI
Yes.
students in our diversity, equity,
Yes.
and inclusion work? What kind of changes do we need to be making in higher ed? How can we encourage others to include AAPI in our understanding of what
Yes.
American diversity is?
Good question. You know, sometimes people will say, well, we don't have an Asian American Studies department or program, that's why we can't teach it. Well, that's a cop-out answer, isn't it? Huh? That's cop-out. Don't accept that answer just because you don't have an Asian American program yet. I mean, if we wait till they establish a program before we do anything, we wouldn't have much of a university, would we? Okay, so what you need to do is go to all the departments, say, let's start with the history or anthropology department or political science department. I know the faculty from those departments. And said, how about including some of this history that is American history? No? Into how we teach the courses we already do teach, right? How can we teach about the Vietnam War without teaching about Vietnamese Americans, for example? How can we teach immigration history without teaching about the Exclusion Acts? No? How can we teach about the model minority without linking it up to accusations of Chinese scientists being spies because of our fear of China or Japan? You see, this is why my lecture was written with that in mind. It's all linked. No, we don't teach Asian American history in a silo. No, it's always in connection with the rest of history. That's why I say don't look at Asian American history as, you know, just for a small group of people on our campus. It's for everybody. You learn about ourselves. Remember my opening statement? We learn about ourselves by looking at how we look at Asians among us. It's really holding up a mirror to ourselves. So my answer is, don't let the professors off the hook. Go to them and say, you should take it, okay?
I have a follow-up question, and then I'll go over there to pass over the microphone. But, you know, that is very apt, and I 100% think that, yes, that is definitely a way to go, but how do we go about promoting that and promoting that solidarity, especially in regards to like departments that maybe, you know, haven't conceptualized AAPI history as like American history? How do we promote that? And how do we also create trust among like the diverse ethnic groups under that AAPI label? You know, it encompasses so many broad ethnicities, backgrounds, immigration patterns. And so because of that, it's kind of hard to get people to agree sometimes, especially.
Well, sometimes because we don't know what AAPI history is. We don't know it, but we know what Black history is, right? Because we've been teaching that for a while now. We have some idea of African American history. We have some idea, but gosh, you know, in the beginning, you probably had the same kind of look. Well, we don't know what it is, no? I mean, look, don't go to Florida because they still think they don't know what it is and it shouldn't be taught, right? Today, we're talking about there are still some people in this country who don't think it's worth teaching or should be taught. But if you think my lecture today was interesting, if you think you learned a lot, haven't you all learned at least one thing from my lecture? If not 5 things or 10 things? Huh? Did you think it was interesting? Yeah? Did you think it taught you something about all of us? Right. So that's what you need to know. You just say, hey, we heard a lecture, and it isn't just about a narrow slice of America. It's about all of us, right? Yeah. You need to convince your professors that they need to go back into some training if they don't know already. And by the way, the good news is, just like African American history, Asian American history, Latino history, Native American, just go to the library, just go on Amazon, just go. We have produced so many fabulous books, so many fabulous books. You can't even begin to track the scholarship. It is so rich, it is so diverse, it is so interesting. Huh? It just, I can't begin to tell you, I can't keep up with all the new scholarship. It's too rich, no? And so the research is there. The press is, listen, every time I go to a conference and present my work, I got 5 publishers saying, can we publish your book? I said, I haven't written the book yet. But they say, oh, what you say is so interesting. We'd like to publish your book. I say, well, I'm working on it. I'm not done yet. Okay? But truly, the publishers find our work very interesting. They want to publish it. No? And if your professors, if the faculty members here don't know it, well, maybe you should be the one to tell them. Right? Yeah. I mean, that's what education is. No? Education is to open up your eyes to something you didn't know before. And guess what? Once you learn enough about things you don't know, you have to change your worldview. You can't just say, well, that's another fact, I'll chalk it up. That's enough. If you garner enough facts of things you don't know, you have to say, well, maybe I have to rethink my whole conceptualization. Maybe I have to rethink everything. So I am against textbooks that I call the textbooks, you know how textbooks do? They have shaded areas, no? They tell a story, and then they have shaded areas. Oh, here's what black people are doing, here's what Asians are doing, here's what Mexican Americans are doing. But the master narrative remains the same. I say, you can't do that. You can't keep the master narrative the same if all of us are doing different things, no? You gotta change the whole narrative, you see? It's hard, yeah, but there is, I don't wanna make it too simple. There is a backlash, in part because we have been so good at telling a different story. No? You know what I'm trained at? I'm not trained in Asian American history. That's not what I teach at Brown. I'm a Latin Americanist. My course this semester is on the Mexican Revolution. No? I teach in Spanish. I'm Chinese, I teach in Spanish. How about that? Right? No, I don't preach multiculturalism. I practice it. See? So, but I find this history so fascinating. No? Yeah. So, yes.
I just had a question and more of a comment. One of the things with Asian American PI, we forget about the PI.
Yes.
The Pacific Islanders
yes.
and the
Thank you
roles
for
they
asking.
play in the
Yes.
history. And as a native Hawaiian, as a Kanako
Yes.
EV,
Yes.
it's very important that I
Yes.
want to highlight Pacific Islanders also and their contributions.
I'm so glad you asked that, because that will get us into yet another hour or so of discussion. Should PI be attached to AA? Oh my goodness, okay. Don't hang me, but I don't think it should, personally speaking. I think Pacific Islander history is very different from Asian American history, okay? Pacific Islander history in many ways, another project, I just wrote a big fat grant, multi-million-dollar grant called Global Indigeneity, and it's about Pacific Islanders. I think Pacific Islander peoples are closer to indigenous peoples because they're off the land. They're not immigrants for the most part. I know there are a lot of Samoans and Hawaiians who've left, but at the core, we're talking about people with a land base. No? So at my university, we talk about Pacific Islanders as part of indigenous, people of the land. And so we have I just wrote a big fat, don't know if I'm going to get the money, but we're proposing a research project and a teaching project on indigenous peoples, right? And that's really what Pacific Islanders are, see? Because Hawaiians are not the Japanese who immigrated to Hawaii. When we talk about Hawaiians, we talk about the people who were there before the banana growers got there, or the pineapple growers and the missionaries. Yes, please. Did you have a question?
Oh, yeah. We actually had a question from one of our online attendees. So Asian Americans account for at least 60% of the top scores on the SAT. So what explains the disparity of Asians in higher education? What's the reason for that?
What's the reason for why Asian Americans get the top scores in the ACT? I'll tell you. I know the answer to that. Remember I told you Asian Americans are bimodal, right? That's a top score. Why? Because of post-1964 immigration laws that select in immigrants who are better educated. In the 19th century, who were the Asians we recruited? Laborers. In the 20th century, we say we don't want any more of those coolies coming over. We want better educated. And so these are the children of those well-educated Asian immigrants who have come since the immigration law was changed. No? And do you know who else, besides these Asian Americans, which is the single largest group of well-educated immigrants? Africans. Thank you. Africans. Why? Because of selectivity. Immigration laws, just like the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, is always based on selection. Why do we have so many Mexicans who are so-called undocumented? Huh? Do people choose to be undocumented? Is undocumented an inherited status? No, it's a constructed status. It's because we don't want to give those Mexicans a decent visa, a regular visa, because why? They come in to do low-pay service jobs, and we want to be able to deport them when we don't need them. It's much easier to deport people who don't have documents than to deport people who are documented. You think that's accidental? I say no. I say it's intentional that we keep most Mexican Americans undocumented or Central Americans undocumented, because we want to be able to use the cheap labor, and we want to be able to deport them or send them out when we don't want them. Do you know that during World War II, during the Depression, 1929, 1930, I love to teach history because I can shock you all with all kinds of historical facts. We deported over 1 million Mexicans from this country during the Depression. Over 1 million, and guess what? More than half of them, just like those Japanese that we interned, more than half of those so-called Mexicans we deported were U.S. citizens because they were the children of the parents who were the children born on U.S. soil. That's why the 14th Amendment is so important. It was never intended to give citizenship to otherwise undocumented immigrants like the Chinese and the Mexicans. But the 14th Amendment, remember this case, Wong Kim Ark, W-O-N-G, Kim, K-I-M-A-R-K. Look up that case, because Wong Kim Ark was among the first Chinese born on U.S. soil of parents who were aliens and eligible for citizenship. And he took his case all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court's 14th Amendment takes precedence over everything else, because it's an amendment. And the 14th Amendment says if you're born on U.S. soil, you are automatically a U.S. citizen. And so Wong Kim Ark became a U.S. citizen. That's why all those Japanese children interned in the concentration camps, 60% were U.S. citizens. Do we tolerate interning U.S. citizens? Do we tolerate deporting U.S. citizens? Yes, we have. We've done that. You may say it's unconstitutional, but we've done that, and we will do that again. It's going to happen again, because we violate our Constitution all the time. See? So that's a long-winded answer to what she thought was a quick question, right? Selectivity in immigration. Who do we select to give a visa to? Who we deny a visa to? All that is by design.
Can we give a big hand for Dr. De-Hart?
It's just a history lesson I gave you, nothing else, okay?
On behalf of the AAPI FSU board, we'd like to thank you all for taking time. I know time is precious and effort for coming. We'd like to thank Dr. De-Hart for sharing wisdom and encyclopedic knowledge, and I'm sure you can talk to her after if you have time. Thanks for coming. And please, well, you've probably seen the link to our survey and our website. Please navigate there if you can. Thanks. Bye-bye.